Hi everyone, this has been one of the most requested cases, and I want to thank all of the people whose names are on screen for recommending it. If you also mentioned it but I missed your name out, I apologise, but thank you for the suggestion. However, I need to say two further things. Firstly, this video comes with a warning, as it does discuss the murder of a very young child, so please be warned. Secondly, and quite importantly, there are some legal issues regarding this case. Specifically, both killers have lifelong anonymity, and several people have ended up in court and even gone to prison for publishing details on social media about their new identities and locations. That issue I'll talk about in a bit, but just to be careful about posting information about anyone on here, especially speculating that someone may or may not be the people involved under their new identities. It could cause issues for you and for me. I'll keep a close eye on the comments to remove anything like that, but honestly, you can comment on the case and express your thoughts, anger and disgust, which I would welcome, without including potentially sensitive information. Anyway, on with the video. On the afternoon of Friday the 12th of February 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger was out shopping with his mother Denise in the new Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, a town in the northwest of England. Just before 3:40 p.m, Denise went into a butcher's shop and, whilst paying for some items, she let go of her son's hand briefly. This decision would haunt her for the rest of her life, as in less than 5 minutes, James had wandered outside on his own, approached two strangers, and was led away from the shopping centre. This infamous and haunting CCTV image, taken at 3:42 p.m, shows the abduction of James Bulger. He was then walked 2.5 miles to a location where he was tortured and murdered, with his tiny body being left on a train track, where it was cut in half and discovered in this horrific state 2 days later. This crime was horrific enough, but the nation was in shock when 4 days after James's body was found, the perpetrators were arrested. They were Jon Venables and Robert Thompson, both just 10 years old. On the day that James was abducted, both boys had been searching for a little boy that they could abduct and kill. In the brief moment that James was separated from his mother, the pair took this opportunity and led James to his death. This case has continued to cause anger in the 30 years since James's murder, not only because of his horrific death, but also because of the short sentences that both of his murderers served, the fact they were given new lives and new identities, and that one of them, Jon Venables, has committed further offences, including possessing sexual abuse images of children. However, he's been able to maintain his anonymity throughout all of this. This case is horrific, tragic, and raises serious questions about the amount of protection given to those who commit the worst crimes imaginable. Welcome to Evil Among Us. James Patrick Bulger was born on the 16th of March 1990 in Kirkby, a town in the county of Merseyside in the northwest of England, to his parents Ralph and Denise Bulger. His parents were elated by the arrival of a healthy and happy baby boy, as they had previously had to go through the agony of losing a daughter who was stillborn. They would have to go through more unimaginable pain less than 3 years later when James was snatched away from them. Denise wanted her son to be remembered for the child he was, not the horrific way that he died. She described her son as, quote, very bubbly. He loved dancing to Michael Jackson videos and making people laugh. My happiest memory of him is him running towards me with his hair bouncing everywhere. He didn't walk anywhere. He'd run into your arms with a big smile on his face. Both Mum and Dad loved nothing more than their daily routine with their son, playing with him, giving him his dinner, bathing him, reading him a bedtime story, putting him to bed. Denise said, quote, there was nothing I loved more than tucking him up at bedtime and knowing he was safe and cosy. James shared a room with his parents, sleeping in his own bed right next to theirs, so he was always close. James Bulger was on this earth for less than 3 years, but it's clear that he was a shining light in his parents' lives. Those of us in the UK have all seen pictures of James, but I think it's important to remember that behind that photo was a little boy who ran around like a mad thing, who laughed, cried, loved, and was loved. James would today, 30 years after his death, be just 33 years old, a young man. As Denise stated in 2021, quote, would he be married? I don't know. Would he be a dad? I don't know. It's things like that that play on my mind. but his potential for any sort of future was snatched away on the 12th of February 1993 by two evil and dangerous children, 10-year-olds Jon Venables and Robert Thompson. Jon Venables was born on August 13th, 1982, in the city of Liverpool, to parents Susan and Neil Venables. He was the middle child of his two siblings, both of whom had developmental issues. His older brother was born with a cleft palate, which led to communication difficulties and bullying, which resulted in him having often extreme temper tantrums in the home, which his parents struggled to deal with. His younger sister also had significant issues, and both siblings attended special schools. It appears that Jon was often neglected in his home and began to act out, with him too being prone to tantrums, likely as a way to vent his frustration, but also to get attention. The relationship between the parents was toxic. Susan and Neil would often argue in front of the children, with Susan then storming out of the house, taking the children with her to live with her mother, before presenting herself at the council and demanding accommodation. When the children were beginning to settle in their new accommodation, the pair would reconcile, meaning the children went from pillar to post with no sense of stability. Both Susan and Neil had histories of depression, but it appears that Susan's behaviour was most problematic around the children. She was reported as often having, quote, hysterics when she couldn't cope, and would take her frustrations out on the children. I've read a few articles which seem to suggest there was no violence in this household. This doesn't seem to be true at all. It appears that Susan was a strict disciplinarian who would beat and verbally abuse her son. Later, police were aghast at her behaviour when her son was arrested for the murder of James. Her main focus seemed to be, quote, constantly repairing her makeup, and it seemed like her main concern when attending the subsequent court proceedings was her physical appearance. The police apparently did not like her, and this information seems to portray a woman who was more interested in herself than the welfare of her children. Being raised by a parent who may be a narcissist would likely not result in the child developing empathy and compassion for others, and also growing up very self-entitled. The neighbouring children would mock Venables and his siblings, doing so because they knew they could get a rise out of him. As a child, Venables became more and more angry. The impact of growing up in this environment was soon seen at school. In 1991, when Venables was 9 years old, teachers had significant concerns about his behaviour. He would be disruptive in class and engage in attention-seeking behaviour, including rocking back and forth on his chair, moaning and shouting out randomly. He also started to become violent, both to himself and others. He would bang his head against his desk and throw himself on the floor. He would also tear his own clothing. These incidents always seemed to be when someone was watching, so it appears they too were attention-seeking behaviours, but also, in my opinion, a reflection of the disturbed young man he was. However, Jon Venables soon began to direct violence towards others, and this was in the course of him bullying his classmates, who he began pushing and shoving. But there was an incident when Venables was again around 9 years old, which represented a serious escalation in his behaviour, when he approached a classmate the same age from behind, and began choking him with a ruler, which was pressed against the boy's throat. Venables was intent on causing this child harm, and it took 2 teachers to drag him off. Venables would also be destructive around the school, ripping artwork off the wall, flipping over tables, and generally being disruptive. Venables would bottle up his feelings. He would state that he was fine, and everything at home was okay. He's a child who, it's believed, grew up with a deep sense of hatred and resentment towards his parents. As an aside, there's an important issue to raise. At the time of the murder, the press jumped on the issue of, quote, video nasties, and the link this apparently had to the murder. Specifically, Venables' father Neil was known to rent movies regularly and watch them with his son. This included some horror films, but particular focus was made on a rental that Neil made on January the 18th, 1993, around 3 weeks before the murder of James Bulger, and that was the film Child's Play 3, about a killer doll called Chucky, who's possessed by the spirit of a child murderer. The press made a big thing about this, but this is, in my opinion, a very myopic and narrow view, which quickly fell away. But cynically, I think it was just an excuse to publish the box art from this movie, which clearly caught the eye and increased newspaper sales. Anyway, due to Jon Venables' behaviour at school, he was held back a year and eventually transferred schools, where he met Robert Thompson. Robert Thompson was born on August 23rd, 1982, again in the city of Liverpool. His upbringing was nothing short of hellish. He was the son of Robert Thompson Sr. and Anne Thompson. Anne was herself the product of an abusive home, where her father would beat her mother, and unfortunately, she was drawn to this type of man. Thompson Sr. was such a man, and their relationship was characterised by extreme violence, with him being an alcoholic who would mercilessly beat his wife. The pair had 6 sons, with Thompson being the second youngest. As well as watching their mother being beaten, all of them were subjected to the same abuse. Thompson would later state that on one occasion, his father thought he'd stolen chocolates from the Christmas tree, and so told him to strip. He then got a pair of scissors and threatened to cut off his son's penis. Anne, likely trying to gain some sense of power in her own life, would also victimise the children, beating them with sticks and belts. Thompson Sr. eventually left the family home, and Anne struggled to cope, turned to alcohol as a way to escape, as she attempted suicide on several occasions. The children were also deeply affected, and, no doubt replicating the behaviour of their father, the older boys would bully the younger ones, including beating them and locking them in confined spaces. All of the children were severely damaged due to the abuse in the family home. The eldest son was removed from the family home by social services due to the abuse he'd suffered. One of the other brothers became a prolific thief and would take Thompson with him whilst committing his crimes. Another one became an arsonist and was suspected of sexually abusing children, including Thompson. Another one voluntarily entered the care system rather than live in this environment. Another had to be restrained when he tried to attack a teacher, and several of the siblings attempted to commit suicide. It was not uncommon for the children to be seen walking the streets of the local area in the early hours of the morning, and all of them were well known to the police. As his elder brothers abused him, Thompson abused his younger sibling Ryan, and his behaviour towards him is, in my opinion, important. Thompson would intimidate Ryan and would bully him into playing truant so that the pair could wander the streets committing crime. Thompson would take great glee in abandoning his younger brother, including along the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, a place which would be relevant to the crime against James Bulger. However, the pair seemed to share a strange bond. They would often be found sleeping together, sucking each other's thumbs for comfort. Robert Thompson was desperate for the attention of his mother, but appears to have been neglected throughout much of his life. It appears that his anger increased significantly when, in around October 1991, Anne gave birth to her 7th child, a boy called Ben. Her attention was then on this new child, which likely made Thompson feel even more neglected and marginalised. In school, Thompson didn't demonstrate any particularly violent tendencies, but he was frequently truant, and, when he was there, he was described as, quote, shy and quiet. It is noted, however, that he was extremely manipulative and would cheat, lie and steal in order to get what he wanted. He too was held back a year. Venables was transferred to Thompson's school, and a chain reaction started that would lead to the horrific murder of an innocent 2-year-old boy. Almost as a foreshadowing of what was to come, the friendship of Jon Venables and Robert Thompson began with violence. They met in September 1991, 17 months before they murdered James Bulger, when the pair literally bumped into each other in the school playground. They then had a fight, but when this ended, they seemed to be impressed with the other's use of violence, began to bond, and soon they were spending all their time together. The school was concerned about their association, as they appeared to bring out the worst in each other, but whilst their interaction could be controlled within the classroom, there was nothing that could be done to stop them outside of this environment, and the pair spent most of their time together. It was a match made in hell. I'll go into greater detail about the traits that I think led to what happened next, but generally, you had 2 very damaged children who had, to varying degrees, normalised views of violence, significant issues with anger, a desperate need to be accepted, stunted development of empathy and guilt, and of greatest importance, a belief that the way to feel powerful was to abuse those younger than them. With regards to this last point, the pair began bullying younger children together, including assaulting them, apparently just for their own amusement. They were truant frequently, but would go around the local area being antisocial and committing crimes, mainly acts of theft, and they would often go to the new Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle to hang around and cause a nuisance. This is where they were on Friday the 12th of February 1993, but on this date, they had a more sinister plan: to abduct a child. and James Bulger would unfortunately become their target and would lose his life as a result. On the morning of Friday the 12th of February 1993, Jon Venables left his home in the Walton area of Liverpool and made his way to school. He was apparently excited, as this was the last day before the half-term break, and he had a note in his bag from his mother, asking if he could take the class gerbil home to look after over the week-long holiday. When Venables got to school, he met up with Robert Thompson, and the pair decided to play truant. They first spent time in the shops in County Road, near Walton, and were discussing what to do next. What's known for sure is that both children decided they want to abduct a smaller child, but why is not clear. They both gave varying accounts, including that they wanted to take a child and simply release him a bit further away, so that he'd be wandering the streets in a lost and distressed state. They also said they wanted to take a child and deliberately push him in front of traffic, take a child, release him, and then hope he just walked into the road and would be hit by a car, and also take a child simply to assault them. I think, as I state later, they did intend to find someone to kill, but even if you disagree, I think it's clear their intention was to do serious harm to an innocent child. The pair ended up at the new Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle around 12 p.m. and spent the next few hours shoplifting and engaging in antisocial behaviour. They stole various items including sweets, a troll doll, some batteries and a can of blue paint. Everywhere they went they caused issues. They kicked a can of paint in one shop until it started to leak and were kicked out. They teased an elderly woman, poking her in the back then running off. They climbed all over the chairs at a McDonald's until they were chased out. They were asked by several people why they weren't in school, but simply stated they were on holiday. However, they also spent the time looking for a target, with Jon Venables apparently taking the lead in trying to coax children away from their mothers, including tapping on windows and beckoning them to come outside. They were captured on CCTV in the shopping centre, with Venables on the left and Thompson on the right, this grainy CCTV image. Terrifyingly, it appears in the hours before they abducted James Bulger, Venables and Thompson came within a hair's breadth of abducting two other children, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old boy. The first incident occurred around 2 hours before James's abduction. A mother was with her 2 children, boys aged 4 and 7, when she lost sight of the 4-year-old. The older brother began to panic and went looking for his sibling, who he found standing with a pair of older boys, with one of them talking to the child. The older boy beckoned his mother over, and she said she saw 2 boys and, quote, "One had his head down, and the other held my gaze with eye contact more than normal until my son came back to where I was standing. One mumbled something to the other, and they walked off." An hour before James's abduction, a woman called Diane was in a department store in the shopping centre, with her 2-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter. Both children moved towards the entrance of the shop, where Venables and Thompson were standing, and Diane heard one of them say, quote, "Shall we take one of these?" She thought he was talking about stealing a purse. Diane took her children to the till, but her son kept returning to the boys, and she had to drag him back 3 times. She later recalled, quote, "When I was paying, he disappeared. I asked my daughter where he was, and she said, 'He's gone with the boys.' I looked up the aisles but couldn't see him, and went out of the shop. Then I caught a glimpse of him dashing around some benches. If I hadn't looked in his direction at exactly that moment, I wouldn't have seen him. As I came round the benches, I saw Venables run and stop twice. He was enticing my son to follow. He dived behind a post, hugging it, and beckoned. I screamed and shouted to my son, but he wasn't coming. He was more interested in the boys than me. They were running and stopping, and he was catching up. It was a game. Then, as I was shouting, Venables saw me and told my boy, 'Go back to your mum.' He was pleasant looking and smiling all the time. My son came back and I told him off. Later, Diane was struggling to come to terms with how close she came to losing her son, with her saying, quote, 'Even when these boys were trying to lure him away, I remember thinking, they're only children, aren't they? Kids can't harm kids.' But they were really crafty." Despite these failed attempts, Jon Venables and Robert Thompson were undeterred. They were fixated on finding a child to abduct. They then went to the lower floor of the centre and were loitering around a snack kiosk when they saw 2-year-old James Bulger standing by the door of Time's butcher's shop. The time was just before 3:40 p.m. James Bulger had been at the shopping centre with his mother Denise from about 2 o'clock. and they'd been visiting various shops. The pair had travelled to the centre with Denise's sister-in-law Nicola Bailey and her 3-year-old niece Vanessa. Nicola had to exchange some underwear in TJ Hughes, and Denise waited nearby, watching the children. For a moment, James disappeared from sight. He was getting grisly, and made a fuss if he had to ride in his stroller. He wanted to potter along, as children often do. James wandered away from his mother, but soon cried out, frightened to suddenly find himself alone, and Denise quickly found him and picked him up before they left the store. They then went to a clothing store. James was full of energy and was throwing around baby clothes and laughing hysterically when a baby top was accidentally dropped on his head by a shop assistant. At the next shop, James grabbed some sweets and juice before Denise could stop him. Denise took hold of James's hand, and they went to the last shop they planned to go to before returning home, Time's Butcher's shop. Denise later stated, "I went to the butcher's and straight to the counter, looking at what there was on offer. I said hello before pointing out the chops I wanted, all the time telling James to stand still. The butcher shop was small, so there wasn't much space for James to get up to lots of mischief, but he was playing and dancing around a bit. It was definitely home time. I remember clearly that I was by the counter. He was running around in circles, and Nicola was in the corner by the fridge with Vanessa. James was laughing, and I beckoned him over to stand by me. I held onto his hand as the man wrapped up the meat and chatted to me. He was very friendly, and said hello to James before telling me what I owed him. And this is the last thing I remember. I let go of James's hand and looked at him saying, 'Just stand right there by me. Don't move, okay?' He was there right by my left thigh. I smiled at him and pulled my bag from my shoulder, took out my purse, and went to open it to get my money. As I snapped open the clasp, I glanced down and James wasn't there. Immediately I looked over to the fridge cabinet and expected him to be playing with Nicola and Vanessa. He wasn't there. I shouted, 'Where is James?' Nicola told me not to worry. They'd be playing just outside the shop, and he couldn't have gone far. I got to the doorway and stopped to look left, right, and left again. The place was packed. There were so many people I couldn't see a thing. Which way would he have gone? Unfortunately, in that brief moment that Denise had taken her eyes off her son, he'd wandered outside and was beckoned over to Jon Venables and Robert Thompson. Venables then took hold of James's hand and led him away. The time was 3:42 p.m, and this was captured on CCTV. This grainy image shows James Bulger holding the hand of Jon Venables, with Robert Thompson walking just ahead of them. Returning to Denise's account of this incident, she continues, quote, "My heart was thumping, and even then I was full of icy dread. It's like fingers of fear grip your heart and crush it so you can't breathe. I knew right then it was bad. I just knew. It was one of those moments where the world feels like it's turning in slow motion, and you struggle to take in what has happened. I remember this voice in my head, not James, not my beautiful boy. This couldn't be happening to me. I didn't even let him out of my sight. Which way could he have gone? I kept asking myself. Left out of the shopping centre doors, or right into the crowds? In a way, it was a silly question, as he didn't know his left from his right. He wouldn't have understood what he was doing. I stood there feeling sick to the pit of my stomach, and I turned left to start the frantic search. Outside the shop doorway, I had a 50-50 chance of picking the correct way, and no clue at all, so I turned left frantically to start looking. Another seemingly small decision that was to have the most earth-shattering consequences. Unfortunately, Denise chose the wrong way. If she'd have turned right, she might have had a chance of spotting her son with Venables and Thompson before they went up one level with James and made their way towards an exit. Denise went to the security information desk, and they put out a tannoy trying to locate James. She then began frantically going into shops, asking if anyone had seen her son. Unfortunately, she was told that someone had located him at a shop on the second floor and sprinted up there. James obviously wasn't there, but she was told that she may have been given the wrong shop and it was possibly a few doors down. So basically she was running around chasing red herrings. Unfortunately, the confusion and the misinformation allowed 10-year-olds Jon Venables and Robert Thompson to leave the new Strand Shopping Centre with 2-year-old James Bulger, who within 3 hours there was torture and murder. James Bulger was led by Jon Venables and Robert Thompson out of the new Strand Shopping Centre, and they made their way the short distance to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. At this point, The boys planned to push James into the water so he would drown, but they couldn't coax him near the water's edge. It was at this point that James was hurt for the first time, when one of them, both blamed each other in an interview, picked up James and dropped him on his head, causing a cut to his head and bruising. He began to scream and cry out for his mummy. Venables and Thompson apparently then began to walk away. A woman saw James standing there but assumed, as many would that day, that he was the brother of the two boys. For some reason, Venables and Thompson returned and beckoned to James, saying, quote, "Come on, baby," and he dutifully ran over to them. They then covered his head with his anorak in order to try and hide his injuries. This woman was one of 38 people who saw the boys that day, none of whom did anything. In the press, they were called the, quote, "Liverpool 38, and their lack of action adds another element of horror to this case. The boys began walking, sometimes holding James's hand, and other times with him walking in front of them. They then travelled east, walking down Park Street, and then turning down towards the A50-57, and then continuing down the Oxford Road. This route took them past shops, halls, offices, parks, and busy roads, and by this point they'd been seen numerous times. A witness on a bus saw Venables and Thompson swinging James's hands as he walked between them. A man driving past saw the boys apparently pulling James, dragging him against his will. James was crying and clearly didn't want to go with them. This witness then saw one of the boys kick James. It is understandable that some of the people who saw the trio didn't intervene, as on occasions James was seen laughing or completely silent just walking with his abductors, but other people saw acts of violence, including one witness who saw Jon Venables punch James, grab him, and violently shake him whilst he was crying out for his mother. It seems some people did have concerns, but did nothing. The boys continued along the A50-58 and, due to being on busy roads, were seen repeatedly by motorists and pedestrians. There were even people who stopped to speak to the boys directly, and around this point an elderly woman saw James, who was obviously hurt. He was crying and screaming, his face was bruised and red. She asked the boys what was going on, and they responded, quote, "We just found him at the bottom of the hill." She told the boys that they should take James to the police station and pointed in the direction they should go. She watched the boys quickly grabbed up James and walked in the opposite direction. She was worried about James. However, at that point another woman approached her, who had seen James earlier, and said that he'd been laughing, and so they both convinced themselves that Venables and Thompson were simply two elder brothers struggling to deal with their younger sibling. Even if this was the case, James was clearly injured, scared, and distressed. The trio carried on, walking closer and closer towards James's final destination. They eventually ended up on the county road, and it was here that there were several witnesses and opportunities to save James from his impending death. Venables and Thompson dragged James into several shops, with shopkeepers being concerned about how distressed James was. None of them called the police. A woman walking her dog was so concerned that she went up and asked what was going on. Venables and Thompson told her they'd found the lost boy at the new Strand Shopping Centre and were on their way to the police station, which was just a short distance away. Another concerned woman, younger than the first, who had a little girl with her, overheard the conversation and joined in. Alarm bells should have been ringing. Why would two boys who found a child in a shopping centre not have simply taken him to an information desk or into a shop? Instead, they'd now walked 2 miles away from where they claimed they'd found James, passing numerous businesses and shops where, at any point, they could have asked an adult to call the police. The younger woman asked Venables and Thompson where they lived. It appeared Thompson was about to answer, but Venables cut him off. At this point, Thompson was holding James's hand and let go, appearing to be flustered by the situation. However, Venables took control, grabbing hold of James's hand and muttering something about the police station being on their way home. The younger woman with the child saw James was hurt and upset and asked him, quote, "Are you alright, son?" But he didn't respond. Venables said they would find the police station, but this woman felt something was wrong. It was getting darker, and she was sure the boys were lying. The younger woman spoke to the woman with the dog and asked if she would watch her daughter while she herself took James to the police station. Incredibly, the woman with the dog said no, as the dog did not like children. At this point, the boys took the opportunity... I'm sorry, but that's just ridiculous and disgusting. If the dog didn't like children, why did you approach the children in the first place? It's just beyond belief, isn't it, really? Anyway, as I said, at this point the boys took the opportunity, grabbed James and scurried off. The young woman shouted out, quote, "Are you sure you know the way?" Venables pointed in a direction and indicated that he did. After this, they walked into another shop, and Thompson asked the shopkeeper where they could buy sweets for their younger brother. The shopkeeper noticed James's injuries to his face. They then went into a pet shop, where a worker thought it was strange that Thompson was gripping James's hand so tightly. Outside, and further down the street, the three then came across two older boys who knew Venables and Thompson. These boys had a pair of toy handcuffs they were going to use on the pair, but they then saw the injured little boy, and one of them asked, "Who is he?" Thompson said that it was Venables' little brother, and they were taking him home. One of the older boys apparently said, quote, "If you don't take him home, I'll batter you." This was the last opportunity to save James Bulger. At around 5:30 p.m, so around 2 hours after his initial abduction, and 2.5 miles away from where he was taken, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables led this little boy up a steep bank to a railway line near the former Walton and Anfield railway station, close to Walton Park Cemetery, and this is where they would end his life. This section comes with a warning, as I'm going to talk about the murder of a 2-year-old child. This will obviously cause distress to some people. Please skip to the next section if you're not sure you want to hear the details. Both boys later blamed the other for the death of James Bulger, so it's unclear who did what, but they were just as bad as each other in my opinion. The assault against James began with both boys throwing blue paint they'd stolen earlier in the day into his eyes. This caused James to scream and cry. Jon Venables and Robert Thompson threw stones at James, kicked him, and beat him about the head and his body with bricks that were lying around. At some point, he was stripped so his bottom half was naked and his genitals were exposed. Batteries were forced into James's mouth, and, due to injuries discovered at his post-mortem, it's believed that these were also forced into his anus, although they were not found there when his body was recovered. A railway fish plate, which is a joint which holds two pieces of railway track together, was held in the air and dropped straight onto his head. This piece of equipment weighs around 22 pounds, so 10 kilos, and hit the tiny, fragile skull of James, causing 10 serious fractures. Given the weight of this object, it seems likely that both boys were involved in holding it and dropping it onto James's head. In court, a pathologist took 33 minutes to go through all of the injuries that James had suffered. In total, he had 42 injuries over his body, with 22 being to his face and 20 more to his body. These included multiple bruises and cuts to James's face, which were caused by it being stamped on, fractures to his legs, which seemed to have been specifically targeted with kicks and blows from bricks and stones, injuries to his anus due to something potentially being inserted inside of him. In addition, James's foreskin had apparently also been forced back. Having the fish plate dropped on his head had shattered the entire right side of his head. The pathologist could not determine which of the 42 injuries was the fatal blow, but it's clear that 2-year-old James Bulger had been beaten to death. As if this was not horrific enough, James's body was dragged and placed on the railway line, with his upper body being placed in the space between the two tracks and his legs hanging off the other side. Venables and Thompson then weighed James's head down with rubble and bricks and left him, apparently hoping his body would be hit by a train and the whole incident would be ruled an accident. James's body lay there for almost 2 days, until on the 14th of February 1993, his remains were found by 2 children exploring the area. The sight they and the police must have seen is something they will never forget. By this point, James had been run over by a train, cutting his tiny body into 2, with the separate sections being found some distance apart along the railway line. Going back to the date of the abduction, when it became clear that James was not in any shop, the police were called, and they arrived at the shopping centre just after 4 p.m. on the 12th of February 1993. They and security staff began to search the entire shopping centre, asking the help of shoppers to locate the missing 2-year-old. Quickly, Merseyside police mobilised every resource they had and searched for James. Overnight, between the 12th of February and the 13th of February, staff at the shopping centre worked with police to trawl through hours of CCTV footage in order to find clues about where James could have gone. They then came across the CCTV footage, which has become synonymous with this case, and their worst fears were realised. James Bulger had been abducted, but, to their horror, they realised he'd been taken by children. On the 13th of February 1993, Denise and Ralph appeared at a press conference, begging for information about where their little boy had gone. Denise looks distraught. Ralph looks totally lost. On the 14th of February, any hopes of finding James alive were extinguished when the police received a call that the mutilated body of a small child had been found along the railway line, around 2.5 miles from where he had been abducted. The body of James Bulger had been found, and the police descended on the area, photographing everything and collecting all the evidence they could in the hope of finding the monster who killed this innocent 2-year-old child. At that point, the police knew that children had been involved in his abduction, but believed that an adult may have been involved in the actual murder. The police worked to enhance the grainy CCTV footage, and they were able to produce stills of Jon Venables and Robert Thompson, which were in every newspaper in the country, asking for information. On the 17th of February, a woman called police anonymously and said that a friend of hers, Susan Venables, had a son called John, who'd skipped school on the day of the abduction and murder, had been seen in the area with blue paint on his clothing, and he had played truant with a friend of his called Robert Thompson. At 7:30 a.m. on the morning of Thursday, February the 18th, 1993, police officers knocked on the doors of Jon Venables and Robert Thompson, search warrants in hand. Thompson began to cry, and police noticed there was blood on a pair of his shoes. When Venables was taken away by the police, he too cried and said, quote, "I don't want to go to prison, Mum. I didn't kill the baby. It's that Robert Thompson. He always gets me in trouble." Police seized clothing, including a coat with blue paint flecks on it. The boys were formally arrested and taken into custody. Again, at this point, they were the prime suspects in the abduction of James, but not his murder. It still seemed inconceivable to the police that these two children, who had only just reached double digits, would be capable of such an atrocity. Their fingerprints were taken, and, at the same time, a shopkeeper called saying that the boys had been in his shop. The police left and lifted prints. These matched Jon Venables. The same day that they were arrested, the boys were questioned. It didn't take long for them to start to confess to the crime. They began to blame each other, but both disclosed information which enabled the police to develop a picture of what had actually happened. I'm going to play excerpts from the interviews of both children. Just to point out, there's a comment made by Robert Thompson about killing his baby. What he was referring to is his 18-month-old brother Ben, essentially saying if he wanted to kill any baby, he had one at hand. Not the best defence, I think.
This interview is being tape recorded. I'm Detective Sergeant Roberts. Now, what's your full name?
Robert Thompson.
What do they call you? Robert or Bobby?
Robert.
I think Bobby's a more friendly name. Do you agree?
Yeah.
I just want to know a little bit about you now, okay? What's your hobby then?
Skipping school.
Skipping school, is that right?
That's not a hobby, that's a profession, Bobby, when you do it as well as you.
Bobby, I came round to your house this morning, didn't I?
Yeah.
What did I say to you?
No listening.
Correct. What for?
James.
James, what about James?
That you said on suspicion of murdering.
Well, very well remembered. Did you ever see him in the Strand? You shook your head again.
Yeah.
Bobby, was that on the day that we're talking about? Was that on this Friday? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were going up the escalators, they were coming through the doors that there's loads of.
Who was he with?
No,
Little James.
was Mum.
With his mum. He was just running around, was he, James?
Yeah.
Will you tell me exactly what? Slowly, right?
He was just like come here, and then he grabbed his hands and walked up the Strand.
How did he come up to John?
How did he come up to John?
James.
No, he was walking around the Strand.
Who was? James?
The baby.
Was he?
I told him to take him back.
You did what?
Told him to take him back.
You told him to take it back?
All right, Bobby. No,
It's
you're
all
not
right,
getting
Bobby.
all the blame. I'm just asking you, son. I'm trying to find the truth.
We always get the blame.
Wait a minute, Bobby. You see, little James is following you up on stage, right? But on another picture, John, it appears as if John had hold of his hand.
Yeah, well, why are you questioning me and John as well?
John saying to us that he wasn't down at the Strand.
But we were.
I know you were at the Strand, but why should he lie to us by saying that he wasn't in the Strand? He's scared of saying that he was down in the Strand because something happened, didn't it?
That the baby got took.
Yeah.
Not by me.
We certainly admitted throwing stones and things like that.
But he's blaming you for a lot of things.
Yeah, but why
You
is he
understand?
blaming me?
Well, I want to know the truth, right? The whole truth. There's other things going on, isn't there? I know the truth. I believe I know the truth.
I was there.
That's right.
You waved.
Correct, but I know there's a lot of things that have gone on.
Yeah, well, how do you know it was me that killed him? It wasn't. I never even killed him. I'm gonna end up getting all the blame because I've got blood on me.
We're asking you, son, and we want you to tell us the truth, that's all. Not give the blame to you or anything else. But it's only the truth that we're
Yeah, well,
concerned
if Johnny's threw a brick in his face.
Can we just go through slowly, right, what John did with what, right? You said he got hit with a brick first, did he? Then, what did he do?
Another brick.
He threw another brick.
Will I be
2055.
able to go home tonight?
We don't know yet, And I want you to
Yeah,
tell
but I don't
Rachel.
need to answer any more questions, do I?
Come on now, Bobby.
That why I want to kill him when I've got a baby of my own.
I'm trying
If I
to...
wanted to kill a baby, I'd kill my own, wouldn't I?
Was he able to talk?
No?
James,
Yeah?
what did he say to you?
You want me now?
He said that the two of you were in the Strand and that you saw the little boy.
We never. Yeah, we was, but we never saw any kids there. We never robbed any kids.
So you were in Bootle New Strand.
Was you in Bootle Strand?
We never got a kid, Mum. We never got a
Mrs.
kid.
Venables, would you? I must ask you not to get angry with it.
I never got the boy. I never killed him, Mum.
And he said that you took him by the hand and led him out of the Strand shops.
We never. He's a liar.
Calm down. Oh my gosh.
All right, come on, look. But the God's honest truth.
God's honest truth, I'm telling you that we never. He was too scared. He was probably too scared.
A short while ago, as is detailed on your custody record out there, you had a conversation with your mum and you then requested that myself come into the room. Is that right? Yeah. And what was it you told us?
That I killed James. So we walked up to him and we were walking around with him and I took his hand.
And whose idea was it to walk towards him?
Mine.
Was it? What did
Then
you
it was Robert's idea to kill him. And we went outside to the canal.
What for?
Don't know, he said let's throw him in the water. He was persuading him, he said kneel down and let's look at the water and all that, but he wouldn't. Because when we wouldn't get him down, Robert picked him up and threw him on the floor and that's where he got his bump on his head.
What were you gonna? Why were you taking him up to Lotton Village?
Don't know, we didn't know what to do.
You walk along where?
To the train shop. We took him on the rail shop and started throwing bricks at him. I I didn't throw any bricks, because Robert said pick a brick up and throw it, and I just threw it on the floor.
What was Robert saying while he was doing all this?
He was saying stay down, you stupid dick, and all that.
Why did he want him to stay down?
Don't know. Wanted him dead, probably.
Where did the stones in the bar hit him?
In the head.
And you say the bar knocked him out?
Yeah. Onto the railway track.
And what happened then?
No, he was just lying there. Just finished now because I can't speak anymore.
The detectives left the most difficult questions to the end of the interrogation. That was about the trauma seen to James's genitals and batteries appearing to have been placed inside of him. Both boys had extreme reactions to this. Robert Thompson began to cry and refused to answer the question about who had removed James's trousers and underwear. He said, quote, "I'm not a pervert, you know. Well, how would you like me calling you a pervert?" He then said to his mother, quote, "He said I'm a pervert. They said I've played with his willy." With Jon Venables, when asked about the batteries, he became hysterical and stated, quote, "I don't know anything about what Robert did with the batteries." When asked directly whether he'd been involved in putting these in James, he refused to answer and instead began hitting his dad, who was sat next to him. On the evening of the 20th of February 1993, 8 days after they'd killed James Bulger, both Jon Venables and Robert Thompson were charged with his abduction and murder. Both boys appeared in court the next day after they were charged and were detained in a secure unit until their appearance in Crown Court. Within 24 hours of them being charged, word spread across the whole of Merseyside, and by the Monday, reporters had descended on the school both attended to interview anyone and everyone who knew them. However, the courts quickly blocked publication of the children's names, and Thompson became Child A and Venables Child B, although everyone in the local area knew exactly who they were. This didn't stop several pictures of them being published in various newspapers. Jon Venables and Robert Thompson were held at separate units and given new names and backstories they were taught to use. This included telling the other residents they were older than they were and coming up with crimes that would explain their presence in this location, but not revealing the true reason. On May the 14th, 1993, both Venables and Thompson appeared at Liverpool Crown Court to enter their pleas of not guilty to abduction and murder. The venue of the trial was moved to Preston Crown Court to enable the boys to get a fair trial, but also so that a courtroom could be specially modified to accommodate such an unusual proceeding. As the boys were so short, a raised platform was installed to enable them to be able to see over the railings. The chairs in the public gallery were bolted to the floor so that no one could pick them up and throw them. The trial was scheduled to run each day between 9 a.m. and 3:30 p.m, replicating a school day so the boys didn't become too tired. The trial itself began on November the 1st, 1993, presided over by Sir Michael Morland. The behaviour of the boys was very different. Robert Thompson sat in the court, kicked his shoes off and seemed bored by the proceedings, repeatedly yawning. Jon Venables, on the other hand, was anxious, crying, and he constantly looked back, searching for the face of his mother for reassurance. The prosecution opened their case by stating, quote, "You can properly be satisfied that each of them knew it was a serious wrong to take a young child from his mother, to try to do so, and to use such extreme violence on a child of such tender years." The evidence was overwhelming. The security tapes from the shopping centre, the multiple eyewitnesses, the forensic evidence, including blood and paint being found on their clothing, and the boys' interview statements. In addition, both boys were assessed by a psychiatrist who determined that they knew right from wrong. The defences for the boys, who both had their own representation, had to concede that they'd killed James Bulger, but their point was to claim there was no intent. They cited the fact that children wandered about in plain sight, allowing themselves to be seen by numerous people, which indicated they had not planned to kill James Bulger. Instead, it was suggested they struggled to come up with a way to end this incident, and eventually ended up at the railway track, where James died. Each barrister tried to portray their client as the follower, and the other the leader, essentially trying to throw the other boy under the bus. The boys didn't give evidence, and they were almost never spoken to directly. The proceedings happened around them, with adults in the room essentially deciding their fate, whilst they looked on. On the 24th of November 1993, Jon Venables and Robert Thompson were found guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger, making them the youngest convicted murderers in the UK in the 20th century. Jon Venables began to cry when the verdicts were read out. Robert Thompson didn't react. It appeared he accepted he would be found guilty and had prepared himself for this outcome. The boys then stood to be sentenced before Sir Michael Morland. He said to them, quote, "The killing of James Bulger was an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. This child of 2 was taken from his mother on a journey of over 2 miles and then, on the railway line, was battered to death without mercy. Then his body was placed across the railway line so it would be run over by a train in an attempt to conceal his murder. In my judgment, your conduct was both cunning and very wicked." He then sentenced them, stating, quote, "This sentence that I pass upon you both is that you should be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure, in such a place and under such conditions as the Secretary of State may now decide. You will be securely detained for very, very many years, until the Home Secretary is satisfied that you have matured and are fully rehabilitated, until you are no longer a danger." In the UK, the term detained at Her Majesty's pleasure is the wording used when imposing a life sentence on an individual who's committed an offence when they're under the age of 18. Why the wording is different, I do not know. However, it's essentially a life sentence, meaning they'll be monitored for the rest of their lives, even after their release, and liable to recall if they commit any further offences. The minimum term set was 8 years, so both of the boys, who were 11 at the time of their sentence, could potentially have been out when they were 19 years old. A ridiculously short sentence, I'm sure you'll agree. When they were sentenced, someone from the gallery echoed the thoughts of many, with them shouting out, quote, "How do you feel now, you little bastards?" The judge also allowed the names and images of Venables and Thompson to be published, something he was later criticised for, and their faces appeared on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The story of Jon Venables and Robert Thompson goes on for 30 years and is still being written. There are parts of what happened next which will make your blood boil and shake your head in utter disbelief. So beginning with the sentence, this went up and down like a yo-yo. Soon after the trial, the 8-year minimum sentence was changed by the Lord Chief Justice, the most senior judge in the land, to 10 years, meaning they would be eligible for parole when they were both in their early 20s. The Sun newspaper started a petition to get this minimum sentence increased further and gathered 280,000 signatures, with this being delivered to the Home Secretary at the time, Michael Howard. The Home Secretary is one of the most senior positions in the British government, with responsibility for community safety, which includes oversight of all police forces, immigration, as well as MI5. Michael Howard declared that the sentences of Venables and Thompson would be increased to a minimum of 15 years. In 1997, the 15-year minimum tariff was overturned by the House of Lords, one of the chambers of government in the UK, who determined that it was, quote, "unlawful for the Home Secretary, who I remind you is responsible for community safety, to determine a minimum tariff for young offenders." Things got even worse when the defences for Venables and Thompson took their case to the European Commission of Human Rights in 1999, and they determined that both boys had not had a fair trial, and brace yourself as to why, because apparently the raised platform they were seated at was intimidating, and also because they, as children, would not understand the processes in adult court, and therefore were at a disadvantage, as opposed to if they'd been tried in youth court. Nothing I've seen indicates these children were given an unfair trial. They barely participated, because they had professionals working on their behalf, all of whom did their jobs. Being intimidated by a raised platform was the least of their concerns. The European Court deferred determining the minimum tariff that the boys would serve behind bars to the Lord Chief Justice. However, this had now changed, and was a man called Lord Harry Kenneth Wolfe. Lord Wolfe undid the decision of his predecessor and reduced the minimum tariff back down to 8 years, stating that young offenders' institutes were, quote, "corrosive atmospheres for the juveniles." So after all that, the sentence was set back to 8 years. It's so upsetting that the people whose opinions were not taken into account at all were either Denise or Ralph Bulger. They not only had to deal with the murder of their son, but repeated phone calls saying, Good news, they're staying in prison for longer. Then more calls saying, oh, they've changed their mind. This worsened the impact on both of them. Their worlds fell apart when James died. Denise fell into a deep depression, and Ralph was devastated and angry. He later reported that he began to blame Denise, something he ultimately regretted, and the pair's marriage fell apart, and they divorced in 1995. He then, as will be shown later, turned that blame onto himself. An injunction was imposed on the news media after the trial, preventing the publication of details about the boys, including the locations where they were serving their sentences, which were 2 specialist secure units for children. Jon Venables ended up at Red Bank Secure Unit, located in Newton Le Willows in Merseyside. Robert Thompson was confined at Barton Moss Secure Unit, on the outskirts of Eccles, Greater Manchester. The locations the boys spent their sentences was only disclosed after their release. These secure units were housed by staff who worked with the boys to rehabilitate and educate them. This included giving them psychiatric and psychological support. They went to classes every day and both sat their GCSEs and A-levels. It was later reported that both children suffered from PTSD and had flashbacks about killing James. I know I should probably be more sympathetic, but if you've got PTSD as a result of a violent crime that you committed, then that's on you, and it's a consequence of your own behaviour. Over the years it was reported that both children had come to terms with their crimes and accepted they'd killed James Bulger and had taken equal responsibility in doing so. However, the motive for their crime was never fully determined, or not reported anyway. The boys were also given new identities and coached to respond to these names and backstories. Inside, Robert Thompson became a keen artist and in 1999 received a visit from Sir David Ramsbottom, the Chief Inspector of Prisons at the time. He reported back, quote, I have met Thompson. I formed a considerable admiration for the way he is being looked after and the way he has responded. He got a lot of exams and he is a very good artist. I saw his work and he is someone of some talent. He suggested that Thompson and Venables should be released as early as their 18th birthday, quote, to give them some chance to make a life. These comments caused public outrage. I mean, seriously, read the room, dude. Everyone seemed to be forgetting that James Bulger, the little boy who would never have an 18th birthday, because of the actions of Venables and Thompson. Another blow came in January 2001, when an application for both boys to be given anonymity for life was granted. The rationale was that if their location and identities were disclosed, then there was a high likelihood of them being murdered. Denise later stated, quote, as children, one can understand them being given some protection, but what right have they got to be given special treatment as adults as well? Publication of the identities or locations of either of them by anyone in the public sphere is a criminal offence, specifically contempt of court, and this remains the case to this day. In early 2001, both boys could apply for parole, as their minimum tariff set by the court of 8 years expired in February 2001. They each went before the parole board. There's no information about what Jon Venables said to the parole board, but it was later reported that Robert Thompson made the following comments, quote, I do feel aware that I am now a better person and have had a better life and a better education than if I had not committed the murder. There's obviously an irony to this, but it's part of my remorseful feelings as well. I, personally, wish Mr. and Mrs. Bulger and their families to know that I am desperately sorry for what I did, and am aware of the enormity of what I did. A psychiatric report prepared for the hearing stated that Thompson posed a, quote, trivial risk to the public and was very unlikely to reoffend. In June 2001, the parole board determined that both Jon Venables and Robert Thompson were safe to be released, and so, 8 years after murdering James Bulger, they were back out in the world. They'd be supervised by probation for the rest of their lives, as well as having oversight by the police, who would lead their participation in the UK version of witness protection. They had conditions not to have any contact with each other for the rest of their lives. If they breached any of these conditions, or committed further offences, they would be recalled to prison. After this point, Robert Thompson's story essentially ends. He's apparently not reoffended. An old report I found from 2010 stated that a few years after being released, he came out as gay and was in a long-term relationship, living quietly somewhere in the UK. His circumstances are unconfirmed at the current time, but it does appear he's not been back before the courts in over 20 years. The story of Jon Venables is completely the opposite. After his release in 2001, he apparently developed issues with drugs and alcohol. In 2008, Venables was arrested after a drunken fight with a man in the street. Later that same year, he was cautioned for possession of cocaine. However, these were minor compared to what else he'd been up to. On the 21st of June 2010, Jon Venables was charged with possession and distribution of indecent images of children. He downloaded 57 images between February 2009 and February 2010, and this included those which depicted little girls, as young as 2, being raped by adults. Venables had also posed in online chat rooms as a 35-year-old woman called Dawn Smith, who boasted about abusing her 8-year-old daughter, and was using this persona in the hope of obtaining further child abuse images. This offending came to light when Venables told his probation officer that he felt his false identity had been compromised. The officer went round and saw Venables attempting to remove the hard drive of his computer with a knife and a tin opener, which was obviously suspicious. The police were called and the computer taken away for analysis, where the sickening images were found. Whilst the judge ruled that Venables' new identity could not be revealed in court, it was reported he'd been living in the county of Cheshire at the time. The hearing was unusual, as the judge was the only one who could see Venables, with him appearing via video link, with the screen being shielded from public view. Jon Venables was given a 2-year prison sentence for this, but because he'd been on life licence, he was not re-released by the parole board until 2013. He was given another new identity and relocated. In 2017, by this point 35 years old, Jon Venables was again in front of the court, again for possession of child abuse images, which were found on his devices during routine checks. His new identity was not revealed, nor any photos of him published. This time, he was given a sentence of 40 months, but again, due to him being on life licence, his re-release from prison would only be directed by the parole board. However, at the time of recording, September 2023, Jon Venables is apparently still in prison, although he's likely due for another parole hearing sometime before the end of the year. I agree and to some extent disagree with what Denise Bulger said about anonymity. I think we can see why these boys were given anonymity when they were children, and even to some extent why this was extended to when they were adults, as it's true that if people found them, they would likely end up dead. But I firmly believe that this protection should have been on the basis that they would only be given this if they didn't commit any more crimes. Jon Venables keeps sticking his middle finger up and basically seems to think he can do whatever he wants and someone else will sort it out. He's basically saying, okay, yes, I've offended again, but don't worry, I'll get a new identity and a new life somewhere else. No doubt this includes accommodation, which, as anyone who's worked in prison or dealt with people who've been released from prison, is such a struggle to find. Homelessness for people coming out of prison is a massive issue, but Venables gets this handed to him on a plate. Also, I've read, and obviously this is unconfirmed, that he has previously told people his true identity, so placing himself at risk of exposure. At what point do we say enough is enough? He's now 41 years old. How many chances is he going to get? If he offends again, is he still going to be protected? Several people have gotten into serious trouble for publishing details about Venables and Thompson. They've received suspended prison sentences for posting pictures or information which apparently reveals the identities and location of the pair. In 2019, a man was jailed for 9 months for posting this information on social media, hence why I mentioned at the beginning of the video about not posting this information. This is to protect you, not them. On Tuesday the 2nd of March 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger was transported to his final resting place, Sacred Heart Church in Kirkby. Denise wrote this heartbreaking account of her and Ralph saying goodbye to a little boy. Quote, "We didn't know where to start with James's funeral. I should have been pushing him on the swings, not picking out a casket for his body. A body that was so tiny that in the end we had to have one specially made. I did ask if I could see him one last time, but I was advised by the police not to. I didn't get a chance to touch my little boy, kiss him goodbye, or tell him how much I loved him. Perhaps it was for the best. I'm glad that I get to remember his cheeky face the way it always looked. I don't think I could have survived any more agony. I picked out his outfit, the corduroy suit he wore on his last Christmas day. I finished it off with a cream roll neck and some white socks. I decided not to put shoes on him. I'm not sure why. They packed the suit neatly into a bag, along with his favourite teddy, a toy motorbike, and a torch. He always took his torch to bed, so that he could see in the dark and not be scared, so it was really important he had that with him in his coffin. Ralph and I cried until I didn't think there were any tears left. I just felt like I'd let James down, and in all honesty, if I couldn't have him back, then all I wanted was to be curled up in that casket with him. The people of Liverpool lined the streets to pay their respects to this little boy who had touched their hearts. At least 1,000 people stood outside the church to pay their respects. Television cameras were also there, beaming the images into the homes of a shocked nation. His coffin was carried into the church on the shoulders of his father and uncles. During the service, it was surrounded by his favourite things, including a toy rabbit his granddad had bought him, and a chair his father had made for his son. Tapes were played of James's favourite singer Michael Jackson, and the Eric Clapton song Tears in Heaven was played. James was then laid to rest. The inscription on his headstone reads, quote, "In loving memory of a beloved son, James Patrick Bulger, born 16th of March 1990, died 12th of February 1993. There is not a day that goes by that we think of you and cry. You brought us so many happy days. We will always love and remember you, James. May God keep you in his care until the day we get there. Little innocent babe. Love, hugs and kisses, Mum and Dad." Both Ralph and Denise have since remarried, and she is now known as Denise Fergus, and she has had 3 more children, but she has never forgotten James. Every year she marks his birthday. The bravery of both Denise and Ralph is amazing. I say this often, but I think it needs to be said. The strength of people like them to not simply curl into a ball, or worse still end their lives as a result of something so horrific, is truly remarkable. To keep putting one foot in front of the other and carry that pain is something I truly, truly admire. James has not been forgotten by either of them, and I hope he is safe and looking down on them and is truly proud of his parents, and they are all reunited one day. Until that point, I hope he's at peace. Sleep well, baby James. In order to fully understand both Jon Venables and Robert Thompson and the horrific crime they committed, it's necessary to look at them separately and together, highlighting what similarities and differences they each possessed and how this linked to what happened. So beginning with Jon Venables, his childhood seems to have been less characterised by violence within the family home, although this does appear to have been a factor, but the key thing with him is the lack of stability and neglect. It seems as though he was pushed from pillar to post during his early years. I did not arbitrarily mention concerns about narcissistic traits of his mother. It was to raise an important point, that if his main caregiver was focused entirely on herself, then this would mean that Venables likely felt extremely marginalised, isolated and unloved. Also, being raised by someone who was so self-absorbed would have likely led to him developing this trait as well, and failing to develop a sense of empathy for others or remorse for his actions. This, coupled with the focus being on his siblings, who had disabilities, would have led to Venables likely experiencing a significant amount of rage, which he had no outlet for. So, he began to act up at school, trying to get the attention that he was not getting at home, but also using this environment as an outlet for his anger, attacking fellow pupils. Quickly, I think Venables realised that hurting others, especially those weaker and younger than him, was something he enjoyed, and was a way for him to feel some sense of power and control in his life, when he was in fact a very lonely, but also a very, very angry little boy, who was desperate for some sort of connection with someone. With regards to Robert Thompson, as I said earlier, his childhood was like something out of a horror film. His early years seem to have been characterised by violence and abuse. All he seems to have been taught was that harming others was the way people acted, the way that people felt powerful. I believe that at a young age, his view of violence was normalised. He considered this totally appropriate. It's what everyone else did. In line with Venables, there's a strong sense of neglect and abandonment from both his mother and his father, with neither of them appearing to want much to do with him. Thompson was desperate for love and attention, and received neither. He was also abused by his older brothers, teaching him that there's a pecking order. The older children victimised the younger ones, and he himself did this to his younger brother, with him taking glee in leaving him by a canal, revelling in seeing him in distress, knowing he caused this. Again, as with Venables, there was inevitably rage within Robert Thompson, anger at his parents and his siblings, and importantly, I think this escalated significantly when his mother had another child in 1991, a child who was then given the attention that he felt he deserved. I think this galvanised his anger towards those younger than him. Little children took things he wanted away from him. They deserved to be harmed in order for him to feel better about himself. Again, deep down, Robert Thompson was a lonely child, looking for connection. When the two met, you had a perfect storm. Two extremely angry young boys, who both believed that violence against young children was a way to feel in control of their lives, who lacked empathy and compassion for others they targeted, as long as they achieved their aims. They began to bully children together, further normalising their worldview, and, due to the neglect and environment at home, there was no one to challenge this. As time progressed, they escalated their behaviour. I think this is because they felt their behaviour was not giving them the sense of power they wanted, but also because they felt emboldened, because there didn't seem to be any real consequences to their actions. I also think there was an element of showing off to each other in order to cement their friendship. They were both terrified of being abandoned by the other, and so felt they needed to outdo each other with their suggestions and actions. I can imagine them talking, or mentioning they were going to seriously hurt a child, and then the other saying, "Yeah, well, I want to kill a kid," with them essentially childishly trying to outdo each other, but people's lives were actually at stake. In essence, the similarities between Jon Venables and Robert Thompson fed off each other, creating a sum that was greater than its parts, creating a murderous duo when I'm not sure that either of them would have committed such a horrific crime on their own. This led them to February the 12th, 1993, at the new Strand Shopping Centre. I firmly believe their intention was to get a little boy to kill. They were determined to do this, targeting at least 2 other children before they snatched James. I think that both boys, even if they did feel any reluctance, felt they could not show it in front of the other. They needed to prove how tough they were. James's life meant less to them than showing off and feeling a sense of power. My belief that the intention was to kill was the fact they immediately went to the canal with the intention to push him in, but could not coax him to the bank. I think this failure set them back, and being seen meant they had to leave the area. They then walked with James for 2.5 miles, and I think their intention was still to take his life, but they were likely hoping the other would take the lead and come up with a plan of how they were going to do this. Them allowing themselves to be seen by so many people, I think just speaks to the fact they were children, and their brains hadn't developed to the point where they considered consequences. They didn't consider that each of these people could tell the police what they saw. They existed in their own little bubble. They were focused on their mission, and that was it. Whether the walk with James was specifically to get to the railway line, or they decided this along the route is unclear, but this was likely a spot suggested by one of them, due to being familiar with the area, and they knew it was isolated. What happened next will never be known, but it's likely one of them threw something at James, or hit him. This gave the other permission to do the same, and then one escalated what they were doing, and the other followed, culminating in them both dropping a heavy weight on his head together, with them feeling very powerful and dominant by abusing this little boy. However, I think there's one part of the offence which can likely be attributed to one of them, specifically the interference of James's genitals and potential insertion of items into his anus. Some of you might be aware that professionals often pick up on children who have been sexually abused because they start replicating the behaviour they've been subjected to. Given Robert Thompson's likely experience of sexual violence and sexual humiliation, it seems plausible to me that he specifically did these things to James, replicating what had been done to him, being the one wielding the power rather than being the victim. There's been the question of whether the murder of James Bulger was sexually motivated. People far more qualified than me have said no, and I would tend to agree. As I said, I think that behaviour outlined a minute ago was motivated by degradation and humiliation, and not sexual gratification. People have often questioned who was the leader out of the pair. However, I think they were as bad as each other. Whether the pair truly felt remorse for what they did is unclear. For some reason, Robert Thompson appears to have conquered his demons and lived an offence-free life. Why is unknown. Maybe he engaged with therapy better. However, Jon Venables is a completely different matter. He's continued to offend. I think his other offences are linked, but in some respects separate to his crimes against James Bulger. Specifically, I think that him going online and pretending to be a woman discussing abusing her children, as well as collecting images showing little children being raped by adults, shows that he is an individual who still thinks it's perfectly acceptable to use and abuse children for his own ends, and he gets off on watching this and talking about it. This is a similar mindset to what enabled him to justify murdering James Bulger. However, the difference is that it seems his focus has switched to the abuse of little girls to get his sick kicks. One thing I did notice about Jon Venables when researching this case was that he seems to be far more overtly violent than Robert Thompson. Perhaps this is the difference between them. Perhaps Jon Venables is an individual who, throughout his life, both as a child and now as a man, just enjoys hurting others and seeing them suffer, especially children. If this is true, then this suggests that he is still a very dangerous man who poses an ongoing risk to children. The longer he stays in prison, the better for everyone. I sincerely hope that his name fades from the newspapers and that he disappears into obscurity, because I'm terrified that if the name Jon Venables appears in the press in the future, it may be because he's done something horrific to another child. I welcome your thoughts on this case. A reminder again not to post anything about potential locations of either Venables or Thompson. It'll only cause you issues. I don't want that for you. On this occasion, instead of liking or subscribing or whatever else, please, if you have a moment, go onto the James Bulger Memorial Trust website. It's an amazing organisation which has a mission to give holidays and respite breaks to children and their families who may not usually be able to afford these things a lot of us take for granted. They also organise various activities, including trips to the cinema, restaurants, panto and football matches. These are the types of organisation that should have bags of money thrown at them, but that's not how the world works, unfortunately. So please, if you could donate your time or your money, then please do so. I'll leave a link to the website in the description of the video. Anyway, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.